and welcome to Comic Boom, the Comics and Education podcast. If you're interested in hearing more about the crossover between comics and education, then this is the podcast for you. My name is Lucy Starbuck-Bradley, and each week I'll be joined by a fellow educator, an academic, a librarian, or a creator of comics to discuss their journey into comics and provide some inspiration to influence your practice, and hopefully shine some light on titles you can bring into your libraries, classrooms, and onto your bookshelves at home too. This episode of Comic Boom is sponsored by ALCS, the Authors Licensing and Collecting Society. Hello everyone, welcome to this episode of Comic Boom, a little bit later than usual. Thank you for your patience. It's been a bit of a busy time over the last couple of weeks, just wrapping up the summer holidays and getting the kids back into school. But we are back, and with a brilliant episode featuring Isabel Greenberg. Isabel is a London-based illustrator and writer and the author of acclaimed graphic novels, The Encyclopedia of Early Earth, which was from 2015, The 100 Nights of Hero, 2017, Glasstown from 2020, and now very recently released Young Hag in 2024, which we talk about quite extensively in this episode. A great YA graphic novel, all wrapped with Arthurian legend. Really enjoyed it. She's the illustrator of a number of children's books as well. 1 Billion Trillion Stars, Power Up, The Ocean in Your Bathtub, all written by Seth Fishman, as well as several history books that she's done in collaboration with her sister Imogen, all published by Bloomsbury. Isabel studied illustration at the University of Brighton and has an MA in animation from the Royal College of Art. We talk a little bit about that journey in this episode too. And she's an associate lecturer at Camberwell College of Arts. So a wealth of experience, involved in education herself, a brilliant storyteller, and I really enjoyed talking to Isabel about her approach to her work. This episode is brought to you in collaboration, in partnership with the Lakes International Comics Art Festival. We touch a little bit on that too. I talked to Isabel quite early in the year, so she hadn't fully fleshed out her plans for how she was going to work with Lakes International Comics Art Festival this year, but she's definitely going to be there representing her corner of the UK comics art scene. And just a reminder for everyone that at the end of September, the last weekend of September, is the Lakes International Comics Art Festival, as well as the programme for adults, which is very much a kind of book festival format. If you've never been to a comics art festival, LICAF is a bit more of a European format, so it's less of a Comic-Con and more a kind of something, if you've been to literature festivals, that you would be very familiar with, talks by creators and things like that. A really wide range of comics creators from across the globe coming together to talk about their work. Yeah, I really enjoy going along. But alongside that, there's also a whole range of free activities put on by the Little LICAF team for children and young people, and those are entirely free to access, and definitely worth doing so if you are up in that part of the country. I'm not in that part of the country, but I will be making the journey. It was definitely worth it for me. But if you're nearby, take the kids across and see what you can access over that festival period. It's well worth it. Anyway, enough about Lakes International Comics Art Festival, although I could go on all day. Let's hear what Isabel has to say. Hello, Isabel. Welcome to Comic Boom.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
You are so welcome. Can you tell us, to start off, a little bit about your journey as a comics reader? Where did that all start for you?
Well, I think, where did I start as a comics reader? I wish I could say I was like reading comics from the word go, but I think for me, like my journey, my parents weren't comic readers really. So I think there was no like early introduction, and it was really like a case of me finding them for myself. And I think when I was at school, like there weren't graphic novels or manga in the school libraries. Like that just wasn't a thing, you know? And I was a massive reader of all kinds of things. But I think it wasn't until I was about 14 or 15 that I kind of discovered comics. And I think for me, it was more of I loved drawing and I loved writing. And I had this sort of feeling that I wanted to do something that combined the two. And when I came across comics, it was like this, this is a cool thing. I remember like discovering, going to Gosh when it was in its original location opposite the British Museum in London. And the first comic I bought was League of Extraordinary Gentlemen by Alan Moore. And I absolutely loved it.
Amazing.
I think I was really like blown away by the sort of possibilities of the medium. But I think I felt I couldn't draw in that way. And then a couple of years later, when I was on my art foundation, I came across Marjane Satrapi and David B. And the kind of more, I guess, indie comic scene. And that was when I kind of realized that maybe the way I liked to draw could actually apply to comics. Yeah. That was kind of how I decided to get into them myself. But after I read League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, you know, I was kind of on a quest to find comics I like to read. And I read quite a bit of manga after that as well as a teenager.
Have you got any shout outs for any particular titles that people might be interested in checking out from back in the day, and then also more current reads that you're interested in? We love to have some shout outs for titles on the podcast.
What other stuff did I love? Oh my God. I remember I was obsessed with this 20 volume manga series. I remember the title of, but it was there was romance. There was this quiet, arty young girl, and there was a guy with a motorbike, and it spanned about 20 volumes, and I was obsessed with it. I can't remember the title. Maybe someone on the listener will know.
Quest. Yeah. Yeah, I'd love that. Please tweet us if you know what Isabel's talking about. I don't, so I can't help. But what do you think it was then about the comics form that drew you in, when you stumbled across it, that makes it the storytelling form for you, or one of the primary? I know you do animation and things like that as well, but what is it that makes it feel like it's the right fit for you, do you think?
I think until I discover comics, it had always felt to me like a choice, I loved art at school, but I also loved English. And it was always okay, well, I can either do a drawing thing or I can do a writing thing. It didn't occur to me until that point that there was a place where I could do both. And I think that's why as a medium, it really appealed to me. And I think the reason why I guess I've stuck with it all these years is because there's been moments where I've thought, oh, maybe I could write a prose novel this time. And then I've started writing, and then I've been but I think I'll start drawing now as well. And I think it's just, what's quite exciting for me is somebody once described comics to me as being I'm not sure who described this, but, again, shout out to the person who coined this, as it being you're making a film and you're every single person on the production crew. You're the writer, the director, the set designer, the location scout, the costume designer.
Yeah.
You get to do everything. And that is really exciting for me. And I also think that comics kind of sit in this really magical place between films and books. I think that's what the magic of them for me is.
And I'm just thinking around your books in particular, and what you're saying then, you're playing all these roles, and about the importance of world building in your narratives that you create. That seems to be a real feature. Is that something that you really sort of relish?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when I was growing up, the kind of books I loved to read were kind of epic world building kind of fantasy things like Ursula Le Guin, Philip Pullman, the sort of worlds where you kind of dive in and the world feels sort of so, you're sad when you leave it when the book finishes, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I think those are the books I loved. So I've always wanted to kind of write that kind of material too. And I think I'm also interested, I guess, in the concept of world building as a kind of creator anyway, which is kind of why I wrote my last graphic novel, Glasstown, anyway, because I sort of got interested in the topic, the sort of Bronte's childhood world building juvenilia. I got into it kind of because of an interest in world building rather than necessarily because of an interest in the Brontes specifically.
Can you tell us a little bit how you became to be an illustrator? Because I just think there's this podcast is primarily aimed at teachers, librarians, people working with young people who might have these aspirations, and yet it's not obviously their career path was to become a teacher. It's not something they're necessarily familiar with, how to nurture the illustrators, the writers of the future. So, I'm interested to know a little bit about that journey, and I guess which of your educational experiences you think were sort of really influential?
I mean, everyone gets there in different ways. So I don't want to say that my journey was the only way to do it. But I did a degree, I did an art foundation and then a degree in illustration. I think there is now, and there certainly wasn't when I was applying for art school, but there are now, I think, specialist courses you can apply for in comics. But I did a very general illustration course. And it was kind of very much I took my interest in comics with me. None of the tutors on my course were particularly into comics. So there was nobody really there pushing that, particularly as a area of illustration. So it was definitely very much something I took myself there. And that was something I think that as I say, discovered as a teen. I think like the best thing schools can do is fill their libraries with comics and manga. And I think
for sure, yeah.
And I would love it if like comics, graphic novels, comics, whatever, could find their way onto the national curriculum as well. I think that would be incredibly exciting, rather than just being treated as this kind of, oh, they're really useful to get kids into reading, or, oh, you know, if you like art sculpture, you might like this, or you'll be so surprised when you discover that comics can be about serious things too. It's bizarre to me how like those same sort of like newsflash headlines, like it's a comic but about serious things, are still pervasive. And it's slightly frustrating because I think readers understand it, creators understand it, but there's not enough respect for the medium in the kind of cultural canon. Like,
completely agree.
I was looking at Carrie Fransman's and her organisation, which I'm really sorry I've forgotten the name of.
Seasick.
Oh, yes, Seasick. I was fascinated by the research that they did, saying, they were saying that basically like poetry is better funded than comics. And I'm not saying poetry shouldn't get any funding. Everyone should get funding. But it seemed like really strange to me that was the case, given how many people read comics.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I think it's just this perception that comics aren't a serious medium.
Yeah, and I think it's really hard. I definitely think that there's a situation where the people that don't think that, the people that love comics, that understand them, that are immersed in them, are passionate about them, find each other, and then you can kind of get exactly. Then you sort of feel like there's no issue here. Everyone loves comics. Everyone I know loves comics, and you don't realise that it's still out there.
Yeah, and I think there's loads of people who love comics in the UK. I think it's a small but exciting scene. But I think what's really frustrating to me as a creator is that it feels like a scene that's just desperate to be made more available and made bigger, but it's like the gatekeepers, like, why are there no major graphic novel awards? Why are graphic novels rarely... I can think of 2 instances in the last 15 years that a graphic novel has ever been nominated for a major literary award. Why are there should be graphic novels at every single literary festival. And the only time there's ever a graphic novel at Hay or Edinburgh or whatever is if it's perceived to be about something highbrow and literary, or it's in the children's tent. It just makes me really irritated. And there's only a couple of mainstream reporters that will review comics. So I think it's frustrating because it does feel like it's been ready to happen for years, but the kind of more mainstream cultural gatekeepers aren't somehow ready to let it happen. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that there seems to be a shift in the conversation. I do still agree with you that the conversation around children's comics does start with, oh, it's great for reluctant readers a lot of the time. I think I visibly twitch when people say that to me. It's like, not just. Yes, it is. Yes, they are, but also, and everyone else. But I think that there has been a real shift in children's graphic novels, comics, recently, but I think you're right in terms of the adults side of things. That still does feel very separate, doesn't feel part of the conversation.
But then I think what's exciting to me is that the fact that younger readers are reading them with such enthusiasm. These readers are going to age out of
future gen,
the children of the future, etc.
Did you have to fight in? Some people have referenced that it was actually making comics was, even in illustration courses, making a comic was sort of a little bit frowned upon. Hopefully that's not a current perception, but is that something that you ever came across?
It wasn't precisely frowned upon, but I would say that, I definitely got the impression that when I would bring work to crits, it was never particularly well received, So I think there was a sort of time period where I kind of stopped taking comics to crits because I wanted to get, I wanted my work to be received well, and it didn't feel like it was particularly appreciated. But I think it's completely different now, where I teach, like so many of the students are making comics all the time, and you go to small press fairs and stuff, and there's always tables from different art schools and graduates and students. So I think the culture around the kind of traditional illustration courses attitude to comics has done a complete, 360 since I was a student, definitely. And that's a really positive thing.
Yeah, that's really positive. I know we spoke about prizes earlier briefly, and I know that you won the Observer Jonathan Cape Graphic Short Story Prize. What was that experience like? Was that a real springboard for you? Did it change your plans for career, or was it just a boost on the way of what you were already planning?
Yeah, no, it was a massive deal for me, really. And I think I'd entered the competition a couple of times when I was a student, and I entered it again. I think it was the year after I graduated, and I didn't really at that point have a kind of master plan of what I was going to do exactly. I was being an after school nanny doing small press fairs, and I think my life plan was just to kind of keep doing that and eventually try and I don't know. I was I didn't have a plan. I was just plugging away. I know I had a vague plan in that I knew I wanted to write graphic novels, and I think I thought I just needed to find a day job that would allow me to do that. And so, yeah, the Observer Jonathan Cape Prize, as it was then, was really important for me because I think every entry was looked at by someone at Jonathan Cape. And after I won the prize, I got a phone call from my now editor, Dan Franklin, and he said, "Do you have any ideas for a graphic novel?" And I didn't really, but I thought I'll better think of some quickly. And I was also approached by a literary agent who'd seen my story in the paper and, asked if I wanted representation. Those two things were massive and really changed things for me. And having a first book deal was amazing. I was also incredibly lucky with my first book. I think it came out at a real moment when there was a sort of sudden interest again in graphic novels. So it came out at kind of just the right moment, really. But in terms of did I fulfill my cunning life plan? I did eventually stop becoming a nanny and got a job teaching at a university as my day job, which I still do. Comics still aren't really my full-time day job. I don't know many people for whom they are. So it's kind of 50-50 for me, really, in terms of teaching versus comics and illustration.
And do you find that process of supporting other illustrators in their journey, what do you learn from your students? What do you hope that they learn from you?
I think it's really important to remember, I feel like it's really important to remember as a teacher or whatever, that it was each year, I get further away from their experience. So when I was in my 20s and I was new kind of lecturer on an art foundation course, I wasn't that much older than the students, but now, there's quite a big time lapse between us now. And I think one of the policies or the ethoses, I think, that is often talked about where I teach is that the students are the experts, so whatever it is that they're interested in or they're making work about, they know more about it than you. And I think that's a really nice thing to remember. They're always showing, bringing references and things, to college that they're interested in or passionate about. And I think that's very exciting. Yeah. And I think often you can give someone advice and then a few hours later I'm that was good advice. I should take that on board myself.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit specifically about your I want to talk about Young Hag in detail later on, which I just absolutely loved it. Just read it. I knew, it's one of those things. I knew I was going to like it because I'm aware of your work. I've read some of your stuff before. I knew I was going to like it, but I really, really, really liked it. Your writing for me, it's got a really distinctive voice. It's witty. The characters say things that are just really real, but you're not necessarily expecting them to say. And I just think that you kind of cross this boundary of writing for adults and writing for children, but it seems quite effortless. And I just wonder if that's a conscious approach in terms of not trying to write too young for readers when that's something that could be accessed by younger readers, or sort of how much you think about your reader really when you're writing.
Yeah, I think for me it's really important that I feel like there's no reason why any of my books couldn't be read by a younger audience. And it was after my first book, which was technically it was marketed for adults. And when I realized that younger people were reading it, that was actually, I was really excited by that. And I think since then I've often thought with my books, you know, how much I want to make sure there is a crossover appeal. So Young Hag in America is being entirely marketed as a young adult book, whereas here it's kind of more, it's just in the kind of general graphic novel crossover area. But, you know, yeah, in America it's completely YA. And I think that's quite exciting for me, really.
Will it be like a different cover and things like that?
It's a slightly different cover, and they've added a kind of extra bit onto the title.
Oh, I saw that. Yeah.
It's Young Hag and the Witch's Quest, which I'm not like totally sure why. I think hag is maybe a less used word in America, maybe. But anyway, I decided it wasn't a hill I was going to die on, and I thought, you know, it's okay. I'm not going to dig in on this one.
For people who might not have read the book yet, can you give us a little bit of a synopsis of Young Hag before we talk about it further?
So Young Hag is a young witch in a kind of living in a sort of fantasy Arthurian Britain. And the book opens at her coming of age ceremony when she thinks she's going to come into her magical powers. She lives with her mother and her grandmother, and the three of them are kind of a coven. But after her coming of age ceremony, her grandmother basically explains to her that there's this like family curse that means that they lost their magic and they have this broken sword, and Young Hag's grandmother is about to kind of explain to her the kind of backstory of this family quest and this broken sword and this curse. But then something happens and she never tells Young Hag the story. I won't spoil what happens. But essentially, the book is a sort of a classic quest narrative, and she sets out to basically break the curse and mend the mythical sword. But as she goes, she kind of starts to discover that a lot of the stories that her grandmother's always told her, which are kind of riffs on the Arthurian legends, are kind of her family history rather than distant tales.
What is it that attracts you to those Arthurian legends, the stories of the past? What do you think makes you want to immerse yourself?
I think when I was a kid, I always found like immense comfort in reading and imaginary worlds, like many children, you know. And I think I remember that feeling as a child of loving a book so much that you were just sad, you were devastated when it ended. You know, and you couldn't stop reading, and you'd be like walking down the street holding a book because you're just so desperate to keep reading. And I think that's all often down to sort of the immersive escapist quality of world building. You know, like I still find certain book worlds immensely comforting. There was lots of different like King Arthur adaptations I remember reading as a kid, and they always struck me as really like, again, just like part of that magical world of childhood, I suppose. You know, and it's the stories are so familiar, they were really pervasive in pop culture. I really loved, there was like a kind of early noughties BBC adaptation with Sam Neill as Merlin, and
I don't know why I laughed at that.
It was just so good. I absolutely loved it. And like just stuff like that I always remembered. And I think when I was thinking about what I'd like to make a book about, I kind of thought, oh yeah, I think it's maybe time I dig in there.
And I loved the female characters and the intergenerational relationships going on, and it felt quite kind of feminist approach to the stories of the past, which aren't always known for their feminist ideals. Was that kind of modern spin on it really important to you as well?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of like talk about feminist retellings of things, and I think that if you try and retell something with the eyes of someone from the 21st century, and you're retelling stuff that's from many hundred years ago, I think it's always going to seem, there's naturally a contemporary voice is going to come through and modernize it, and that's the way it should be.
Yeah. I'm super fascinated by your use of colour. It's stunning, it's beautiful to look at, but it's also, it feels really like purposeful, and that it's the colour is part of the storytelling. And I wondered if you could talk to us a bit about your use of colour, because it's like really exciting to see different colour palettes being used. And how did you develop that approach?
In a way, I've actually always kind of struggled with colour, and I don't think it's something that necessarily comes like naturally to me. And so it's definitely something I had to work on. And I think because I found it easier to use limited colour palettes, I enjoyed sort of playing with the idea of using different limited colour palette to indicate different sort of narrative strands or time jumps. So I think for me, colour has become a really useful narrative tool. So that's something I enjoy doing.
And do you is that something that you'll like specifically map out and think like this aspect of the story I'm going to do in these 5 colours, this one I'm going to do in that, or is it a little bit, is it less planned and more organic than that?
It's quite organic. Like I think on account of me not being amazing with colour, I often have to like play around quite a lot. So when I first start a book, when I'm like in the sort of artworking stage, I'll kind of end up colouring a few pages to see if I like the palette or if it works. And I do end up working it out as I go along quite a bit. Once I've kind of settled on it, it'll, then it's just a case of kind of doing what you've designed. But yeah, it's definitely quite organic. And with Glass Town, for example, it was easier in that I knew that there was the past, which I wanted to be sepia toned, the present, which I wanted to be kind of blues and greys, and then the imaginary world was going to be sort of technicolor. And so that like really brightly coloured so that it kind of stood out. And so it felt very important to differentiate those 3 plot strands, because otherwise it was going to get quite confusing to the reader, especially because often the settings and the characters were crossing over all 3.
Yeah, it really works.
I was so late on my deadline for that one that was the only book I've ever actually got any colouring assistance on. And that was quite strange because I had to explain my process to somebody. So I had to be like, here's my colour palette, here are my layers. And that was when I realised how totally chaotic I was when I had to actually explain it to someone else.
Air your laundry. And what is your creative process? And you writing a script fully out first? How does the story come together and to create the final book?
It's kind of, so the writing, I always do writing first, and it tends to be a mix of kind of prose and dialogue. So I'll write out there might be like chunks of script with kind of sections of description, so I know what's going to happen. And some of the description might stay in panels, whereas some of it will go. Often I'll find that when I start penciling, I might have described something and then I draw it instead so it can be cut out, or I might find that actually I really like the kind of voice and I'll want to leave it in. So I tend to write more than I end up using. And it's a kind of process of playing with the panels and deciding what's going to go where and what words I need and what words I don't need as I'm penciling.
And then is the artwork itself a combination of on paper and digital to get to your finished sort of pieces?
Yeah, so I'll do my super roughs, my first stage roughs, often on the iPad or in a sketchbook. Then the final artwork, the line work, is all done by hand. So I just use Palomino Blackwing pencils, and that's it. It's just I use pretty much exclusively that. Previous books I used to use ink and a brush, but the last 2 I've just used Palominos. And then I scan it in and colour it digitally so that you can kind of retain the texture of the line and the pencil, but I like the colour to be very sort of flat so that it's the texture of the line work and the paper itself that gets to shine through. For me, digital stuff is it's really useful for colouring, for cleaning up. I like to add the text. And I also, I enjoy using my iPad for roughs, but I've never found it possible to do my actual artwork on it. I think it's partly a scale thing. I don't like the size of the screen. And also I think you start to know what brushes you're seeing, and that irritates me. There's something for me about the way that you can work over and over and over into an image. Lots of people use it in different ways, but for me, I find that I end up over perfecting. So I rub out and draw again and again and again and again until I think I'm getting it perfect, and then I'll suddenly zoom out and realize it was a terrible drawing. Whereas if I'm working on paper, you kind of have to commit a bit more to the line, and I think that kind of makes me better.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot recently of Linda Barry, and I was just reading something last night. You don't have to think your liver looks good in order for it to be functioning properly, and it's the same with a picture, like with your drawings. Like, you don't, it doesn't have to be perfect for it to be the right thing that's communicating. It is communicating what you want it to communicate. And I just thought, wow, that's a really good kind of way of framing it. And for me, anyway, it spoke to me in terms of not trying to be too perfect and just thinking about whether or not it's serving its function.
Yeah.
This episode will form part of our little special Comic Boom Lakes International Comics Art Festival mashup episodes. This is the second year we've done it. It was really exciting. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what your plans are and just talk a little bit about the festival in general.
Excited to attend, really, and see what it's like in the new venue.
Recently, is it through LICAF that you went to the Toronto Comics Art Festival, or was that as a separate?
Yes, that was through LICAF.
And so can you tell us a little bit about that? There was a group of comics artists sort of representing the British comics.
It was very exciting. They took 6 creators out to Toronto, which was really cool. And we all kind of showed a few books on a couple of big tables. It was really exciting. I think it's quite rare to get an opportunity like that. And I've wanted to go to TCAF for many years, but it's so prohibitively expensive getting over to international comic festivals that, you can only really go if you're invited as a guest. And I think, sort of paid for guest. And it's quite rare to get those invitations, really. So it was a really exciting opportunity to go out there and see the festival. And it was a really, amazing festival, like such an exciting breadth of work, really exciting creators. It had a really kind of great vibe as well. There was sort of a real mix of work, lots of political work, lots of queer work, lots of radical work, lots of indie stuff, but also bigger publishers too. It was a really great mix.
It sounds really exciting. Can you remember the names of any creators that you kind of stumbled across? Did you manage to keep your purchasing under control? Because that's what I'm not very good at.
I bought there was lots of there was just so much great stuff. I got a couple of books signed by big Canadian creators. So I got the new Gillian Tamaki and I got it signed, which was really cool. And it's a really amazing book, Roaming, the new graphic novel. I love that. And I got Carol's new novel and got graphic novel and got that signed by them as well. So it was a really very cool festival. And Toronto as a city was really exciting as well.
Yeah, I've never been. It sounds brilliant. So we're nearing the end of the podcast now. I wondered if you had a few thinking points, things learned from working in education comics, just a few points to leave listeners thinking on. Have you got any sort of summary points that you'd like to leave us thinking about?
I mean, maybe read my book. That would be nice, I suppose. Hug myself a bit.
Definitely should read it. I'll put a link into the show notes as well so people can find it. So our final thing is if we add one comic. Now, this one can't be your own. So one comic or book about comics to our to-be-read piles tomorrow, what would you recommend and why?
Well, I think because I've just been talking about it, the Gillian and Mariko Tamaki graphic novel Roaming, which I brought back from Canada. It's just beautiful. It's a really warm story about 3 students who go to spend spring break in New York in the 90s. And I think it's the late 90s, early noughties. They have flip phones and stuff, so I'm guessing it's then. And
I like the fact that we can date things now by the phones.
Yeah. But it's this really kind of sort of nostalgic tale about, there's just these 3 students and the kind of dynamic between them. There's 2 very old friends who've known each other since they were kids, and then this new friend from one of their college lives, and they kind of come together in New York, and the tensions kind of arise in terms of discovering sexuality and exploring this sort of place and the things they're all 3 of them are bringing to this trip that kind of clash with each other. And I really loved it. And particularly there's these really amazing, sweeping spreads of New York and things in New York City that I've just found utterly delightful and kept turning the pages back to look at them over and over again. So that's the comic I read most recently that I enjoyed. So I'd say add that to your to your pile.
That sounds brilliant. That's really pulled me in. Thank you for that recommendation. And thank you for joining me on the podcast today. It's been great to talk to you. I've learnt a lot and I look forward. I'll hopefully be going to LICAF. So yeah, I look forward to hopefully bumping into you there. I should probably ask what your next project is. We haven't had that conversation. Have you got anything coming up? What are you working on at the moment?
I'm illustrating a graphic novel that someone else has written at the moment, actually, which is quite a new thing for me. So it's coming out in 2025. I think I can talk about it now. It's called The Novel Life of Jane Austen, and it's written by this Austen expert called Janine Barkus, and I'm the illustrator on the project. So that's one thing I'm working on. That's quite exciting. And that'll be out in time for Jane Austen's 250th oh my gosh, I'm going to say Death Day, but I'm wondering now if I've got that wrong and it's birthday. I think it's Death Day. It must be Death Day. Anyway, there's a centenary, a 250th centenary of Jane Austen, and the book is coming out to align with that. So yeah, that's quite a different project for me, not being the writer. And I'm kind of working on a new idea that's very, very early, but I'm quite interested at the moment in the conflict between being a creative and being a parent. I'm a parent to a 4-year-old, and I'm very interested in that kind of push and pull. So my next project is going to be sort of to do parenting and being a mother, but obviously in a highly fantastical way, because I really don't like to draw the trappings of modern life. So there will be no toasters. There will be no bottle sterilizers.
That's super interesting. I feel like this is as a mum of 3 children who are all in exile in their bedrooms at the moment and doing very well. Actually, I haven't interrupted once. Did you find that that becoming a parent did change your approach to your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Young Hag, I began it just after I came off maternity leave, and I wasn't able to dive into months and months of research in a way that I would have before and think about things for ages. And so I think you definitely have to take time when you have it. And that means that you don't have the same luxury of kind of lingering on things. So I think it's made my process maybe more decisive. But also I think when you do something creative, it's like that's another child kind of thing, or another responsibility that has to be looked after. Like I might come up with an idea on Friday afternoon, but I can't write it down until Monday.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that is quite maybe specific to if you do something creative that you love and you want to keep doing it and you want to make art or whatever, but there's also this other like incredibly important thing that you have to do too, and you want to do them both well. So yeah, those are things I guess that I think are probably going to feed into my next project.
That sounds really, really interesting. I've loved talking to you. Thank you so much. It's been lovely, and you've talked about so many interesting things. It's going to be a brilliant episode for the podcast. So thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. It's been really nice.
Thank you so much to Isabel for spending time to talk through her work, her approach to comics creation, and her life as a comics reader as well. Really, really interesting. Some great recommendations too. I've already recommended Young Hag on an earlier episode of this season of Comic Boom, so some of you may have got hold of a copy, I don't know. But I did really enjoy the story. I love Isabel's style, so definitely one to look out for. I'd say it's probably for 13, 14-year-olds plus, right up into adult readers. But that's always really subjective, isn't it? There might be people who think it's also suitable for younger readers, but that would be kind of where I'd place it, more of a YA as well. I've got more book posts this week, as you can tell by the slightly later than usual timing of this podcast episode. Sorry if you've been waiting for it, but I've been really busy. I haven't actually had a chance to sit down and read these books yet, but they are in my to be read pile. And in the book post bag, I've received the brilliantly titled My Big Fat Smelly Poo Diary by Jim Smith, a former winner of the Lollies. Jim Smith Set to be a really funny book. And I'm a big advocate of humour in books. I think, it doesn't have to be serious all the time. We can be a bit silly and enjoy that and encourage that in children's reading habits and not look down on it. So a bit of gross humour certainly appeals to the younger readers in my house. They gravitated to this when it arrived. I really like this simple, accessible drawing style too. I can really imagine children creating their own stories using the characters Pedro, Olga and Ozzy. I think that would be great sort of spin-offs coming from children where they take characters from things that they've read and different media that they come across and put it into their own work. I'd love to see some of that happening with this title. I would say 6+, but again, it's super subjective, so have a little look for yourself and make that decision yourself. Published by Scholastic. And another one from Scholastic that I received for younger readers has also made its way to my to-be-read pile. Let me just grab it. And that is Nina Peanut, Mega Mystery Solver. Quite hard to say. This really appeals to me, and I'll definitely be sitting down and spending some time reading it. Number one appeals to me because of it's by Sarah Bowie, by the way. Number one appeals to me because of the female protagonist, but also it's a ghost story / mystery set in a school. It's things that I enjoy. So, and again, a really super accessible, doodly kind of drawing style that I could see could encourage people to start drawing their own comics. Really colourful as well. So I really like the look of that. It's a nice size. It feels good in your hand too, which is a bit of a book nerd thing to say, but it's true. So yeah, both of those, keep an eye out for those, both by Scholastic, and I'll be settling down to read those over the coming weeks. And we have one more recommendation coming your way, or set of recommendations I should say, because we've got another little mini chat with Barbara, the CEO of ALCS, our sponsor, the Authors Licensing and Collecting Society. And Barbara's just joining us today to give us some of her recommendations for our to-be-read pile. So here's what Barbara had to say. It's been absolutely fascinating to have you on the show and share over a couple of episodes your thoughts and talking about AI, talking about the importance of education around copyright and plagiarism and the role of ALCS in supporting authors. There's been so much food for thought, so I've really appreciated that. And as predicted, you've brought more depth to my understanding of the work of ALCS, and I'm sure listeners' understanding too, just of what ALCS is doing and how important the work is to support authors. It's been absolutely brilliant to have you on. One thing, just for our last slot with you on the show, we always get guests to share a book that we could add to our to-be-read piles. So I thought it'd be brilliant, just as your last slice on the podcast, to have a title that you would recommend us to read. What recommendation would you like to leave us that we can add it onto our to-be-read piles?
Well, I actually had a couple because I did think about this.
Oh, cheating.
Sorry.
Cheating.
Okay. Well, if I have to pick,
no, you can say more than one if you want.
I like my history, and even if it's made up history. So I've just finished the first Outlander book by, I hope I pronounce her name correctly, Diana Gabaldon, and it was amazing. It actually took me 3 holidays to read it. I'm a very slow reader because I'm there in the book, and so I relish every page. My husband can read a book he can read a book in a day, and I'm still like on chapter 1. But I do like history, and my other favourite writer right now is Alison Weir, and I've been reading her 6 Tudor Queens series, and I think it's very good to mix in the history, the real history, with some, if I say, artistic license in there as well, for entertainment. So that would be how I would end. But I would encourage readers to read. It's just amazing, and to borrow books from the libraries. And to be quite honest, every school should have a library, and that's something that we are working with many organisations, including the National Literacy Trust, to try and get the number of primary schools that don't have libraries. And you would have thought in this day and age it should be mandatory, and it's really not. That, to me, if we could make that change together by all asking for this, I think that would make a terrific contribution to society and to the youngsters, many of whom don't have a book in their home. So I think it's very important.
Yeah, completely agree. Very close to my heart. So thank you so much for ending on that message, Barbara, and it's been absolutely brilliant to have you join us on Comic Boom today. So
thank you for having me. Thoroughly enjoyed it, and it's great to be here.
There we go. Thanks, Barbara, for those recommendations. Nice to have something a bit different recommended on the podcast. Not a genre that I massively read from, sort of historical novels, but yeah, really interesting to hear what other people's reading habits are like. So that's it for today. Thanks so much for your patience in waiting for this episode to come out. I just wanted to link to something that Barbara was saying there. So the other big part of my life outside of the podcast is my job at the National Literacy Trust, where I run the school libraries programmes. And Barbara was very kindly flagging some of our campaign work that we do, trying to put a solution to the fact that 1 in 7 primary schools across the UK do not have a library, and that those schools that are in areas of financial disadvantage, they're much more likely not to have a library. So it's those very same children who don't have access to books at home, also not having a library that they can take them out from easily at school too. So that's what we're campaigning to try and do something about, and also working with lots of different funders to run programmes that improve the library provision in primary schools across the UK. You can find that out on their website by searching Libraries for Primaries or National Literacy Trust. So thanks, Barbara, for flagging that. It's all really important work and very much linked to what everybody that listens to this podcast is really passionate about, which is putting stories into the hands of children and young people. That's it for me today. Thanks so much for listening. As always, you can keep in touch with me via the link in the episode, via Twitter on @Lucy_Braidley, or via Instagram on @comic_boom_podcast. Oh, I'd love to hear from you. My name is Lucy Starbuck Braidley. I'm the producer and host of Comic Boom. Thanks for listening.